The moment Hannah Catherine saw the stranger's shadow fall across her pew, she knew her carefully constructed solitude was about to shatter into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. She had occupied the same worn bench in the back corner of Mineral Point's modest white church every Sunday morning for 3 years, ever since the accident that took her husband Thomas and their unborn child on a rain-soaked road just outside town. The other congregants had learned to leave her be, understanding that grief needed its own territory, its own sacred space where questions and sympathetic glances could not penetrate. They filled the pews closer to Reverend Morrison's pulpit, their families spreading across the wooden benches like colorful quilts, leaving Hannah to her prayers and her memories in blessed isolation. But this particular Sunday in late April of 1876, everything changed. The cowboy was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to navigate the world without drawing unnecessary attention. His boots made soft sounds against the wooden floor as he walked past row after row of empty space, past perfectly available seats, until he stopped at her pew. Hannah kept her eyes fixed on the hymnal in her lap, her fingers gripping the worn leather cover until her knuckles turned white. She could feel his presence beside her, could smell the faint scent of leather and sage and the outdoors that clung to his clothes. Without a word, he sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them, and removed his hat to reveal dark hair that needed a trim and eyes the color of storm clouds rolling across the Wisconsin hills. Reverend Morrison began his sermon, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm, but Hannah heard none of it. Her entire awareness had narrowed to the man beside her, this stranger who had violated the unspoken agreement that had governed her Sunday mornings for so long. She snuck a glance at him from beneath her lashes and found him staring straight ahead, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his expression serious and attentive, as though he had always sat in this exact spot and intended to continue doing so for the foreseeable future. Anger flared in her chest, hot and unexpected. How dare he? How dare this man intrude upon the one place where she could exist without explanation or expectation? When the service ended and the congregation began to file out, exchanging pleasantries and making plans for Sunday dinner, Hannah remained seated, hoping the cowboy would take the hint and leave. Instead, he turned to her, his gray eyes meeting hers directly, and spoke in a voice that was deeper than she had imagined, roughened by years of shouting over cattle and wind. "Morning, madam. Name's Isaac Irwin. I hope you did not mind me sitting here." She did mind. She minded very much. But something in his steady gaze made the sharp words die on her tongue. "Hannah Catherine," she replied stiffly, rising to her feet and smoothing her black dress with trembling hands. "And yes, actually, I did mind. This is my pew." Isaac stood as well, towering over her by at least a foot, and she saw surprise flicker across his features before something that might have been amusement replaced it. "Forgive me, Mrs. Catherine. I did not realize the seating was assigned." "It is not assigned," Hannah said, her voice sharper than she intended, "but it is understood. Good day, Mr. Irwin." She swept past him, her boots clicking against the floorboards with more force than necessary, and emerged into the bright spring sunshine. Mineral Point spread out before her, a mining town that had grown up around the lead deposits discovered decades earlier. The streets were quiet on Sunday morning, most of the miners and their families still lingering in the churchyard or heading home for their weekly feast. Hannah lived on the edge of town in a small house that Thomas had built with his own hands, and she walked there now with her head down, trying to ignore the whispers that followed her departure. The following Sunday, Isaac Irwin sat beside her again. This time Hannah did not wait until after the service to confront him. The moment he settled onto the bench, she turned to him with fire in her dark eyes and whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Isaac met her gaze without flinching. "Doing what, madam? Sitting here. There are dozens of empty seats. Why must you choose this one?" He considered her question for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose because everybody needs someone sitting beside them, even if they think they would rather be alone." The simple honesty of his answer stole her breath. Hannah turned away, blinking rapidly against the sudden sting of tears, and forced herself to focus on Reverend Morrison's opening prayer. But she was aware of Isaac throughout the entire service, aware of the way he sang the hymns in a surprisingly pleasant baritone, aware of how he bowed his head during the prayers with what seemed like genuine reverence, aware of the warmth that radiated from his body in the cool interior of the church. When the service ended, Hannah fled without a word, practically running down the church steps and along the dirt road toward home. She told herself she would not return next Sunday, that she would find some excuse to avoid the inevitable confrontation with the persistent cowboy, who seemed determined to invade her carefully maintained isolation. But when Sunday morning arrived, she found herself dressing in her usual black dress, pinning her honey-colored hair into its customary bun, and walking the familiar path to church as though pulled by invisible strings. Isaac was already there, sitting in their pew, and this time he smiled when he saw her approaching. It was a small smile, tentative and genuine, and it transformed his rugged face into something almost boyish. Hannah felt her heart do a strange flip in her chest, a sensation she had not experienced in 3 long years, and the feeling terrified her. She sat down without acknowledging him, opened her hymnal, and pretended to study the words she had long since memorized. "Fine morning," Isaac murmured beside her. "It is acceptable," Hannah replied curtly. "Heard there might be rain coming in tomorrow. The farmers will be grateful." "I am certain they will be." "Mrs. Catherine," Isaac said, his voice dropping even lower, "I do not mean to make you uncomfortable. If you truly want me to sit elsewhere, I will respect your wishes. But I would prefer to sit here if you are willing to allow it." Hannah turned to look at him fully for the first time, taking in the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his collar was slightly crooked as though he had dressed in haste. "Why?" she asked again, but this time the word held more curiosity than anger. "Why does it matter where you sit?" Isaac's gray eyes held hers. "Because in all my years of drifting from town to town, working one ranch after another, I have never seen someone look as lonely as you did that first Sunday. And I know what that feels like, to be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. I thought maybe we could be alone together, if that makes any sense at all." It made more sense than Hannah wanted to admit. She swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat and nodded once, sharply. "You may sit here, Mr. Irwin, but I am not interested in conversation or companionship beyond that. I come here to pray, not to socialize." "Understood, madam," Isaac said. And for the first time in 3 years, Hannah sat through a church service with something other than grief occupying her thoughts. As April gave way to May and the Wisconsin countryside exploded into green life, Isaac Irwin became a fixture beside Hannah in the back pew of Mineral Point's church. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never demanded explanations or tried to draw her into the social fabric of the congregation. He simply sat beside her, week after week, his presence steady and undemanding, until Hannah found herself looking forward to Sunday mornings with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She learned about him in small increments, pieces of information volunteered during brief exchanges before or after the service. He had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 5 brothers, and had left home at 16 to make his own way in the world. He had worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, had spent time in Colorado and Wyoming, had seen more of the country than Hannah could imagine. He had come to Wisconsin following a job offer from a rancher named Samuel Davies, who owned property south of town, and he had stayed because something about the rolling hills and limestone bluffs reminded him of the home he had not seen in over a decade. "You miss your family?" Hannah asked one Sunday as they stood in the churchyard, watching the other congregants disperse toward their homes. Isaac's expression grew distant. "Every day. But sometimes a man needs to prove to himself that he can stand on his own 2 feet, you know. I sent money home when I could, wrote letters when I remembered. My oldest brother Daniel wrote back occasionally, told me about marriages and births and the general goings-on. Last I heard, they were all doing well enough." "You should visit them," Hannah said impulsively. "Life is too short to waste time apart from the people we love." The moment the words left her mouth, she realized what she had said, and pain lanced through her chest. Life was indeed too short. She knew that better than anyone. Isaac seemed to understand because he did not respond with platitudes or sympathy. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Maybe someday." "What about you, Mrs. Catherine? Do you have family here in Mineral Point?" Hannah shook her head. "I came here with my husband 5 years ago. He had heard about opportunities in the mines and wanted to try his hand at finding his fortune. My parents had passed by then, and I had no siblings. Thomas was all I had." It was the first time she had spoken her late husband's name aloud to Isaac, and saying it felt like both a betrayal and a relief. Isaac's expression softened with understanding. "I am sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "I do not know what else to say except that I am sorry." "There is nothing else to say," Hannah replied. "But thank you." As May progressed into June, the boundaries between them began to blur in ways Hannah had not anticipated. She found herself lingering in the churchyard longer, extending their brief conversations into genuine discussions about everything from the weather to politics. To the books Hannah borrowed from Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's small lending library. Isaac had opinions on surprisingly diverse subjects, and expressed them with a thoughtfulness that impressed her. He listened when she spoke, really listened, his full attention focused on her words as though nothing else in the world mattered in that moment. The townspeople began to notice. Hannah could feel their curious gazes tracking her interactions with Isaac, could hear the whispers that followed her through the general store and the post office. Mrs. Whitmore, a kind woman in her 60s who had befriended Hannah after Thomas's death, finally broached the subject one afternoon when Hannah stopped by to return a volume of poetry. "The Cowboy seems like a decent sort, Mrs. Whitmore said carefully, her eyes twinkling with benevolent curiosity behind her spectacles. "Isaac Irwin, is that right?" Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He is merely someone who attends the same church, Mrs. Whitmore, nothing more." "Of course, dear. But there would be nothing wrong if he were something more, you know. Thomas has been gone 3 years. No one would think poorly of you for allowing a bit of happiness back into your life." The words struck Hannah like a physical blow. "I am not ready for that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know if I will ever be ready." Mrs. Whitmore reached across the counter and squeezed Hannah's hand. "No one can tell you when you are ready, dear. Only your heart can do that. But do not close yourself off to the possibility just because you are afraid. Fear is a poor companion for a young woman like yourself." Hannah thought about those words all the way home, turning them over in her mind like smooth stones. Was she afraid? Yes, Absolutely. The thought of opening her heart to someone again, of risking the kind of devastating loss she had experienced when Thomas died, terrified her beyond measure. But she was also beginning to realize that the alternative, spending the rest of her life in self-imposed isolation, held its own kind of terror. That Sunday, when Isaac sat beside her in their customary pew, Hannah found the courage to break their unspoken routine. "Mr. Irwin," she whispered as the congregation stood for the final hymn, "would you care to walk with me after the service? There is a path along the creek that is particularly beautiful this time of year." The surprise and pleasure that lit Isaac's face made Hannah's heart skip a beat. "I would be honored, Mrs. Catherine," he said, and the smile he gave her was so warm, so genuine, that Hannah felt something crack open inside her chest, letting in a sliver of light she had not realized she had been missing. They walked along the winding creek path in comfortable silence at first, listening to the rush of water over stones and the songs of birds hidden in the leafy branches overhead. The late June afternoon was warm but not oppressive, and wildflowers dotted the grassy banks in riots of purple and yellow. Hannah had not walked this path since before Thomas's death, and she felt his absence acutely, a familiar ache that never quite went away. But Isaac's presence beside her somehow made the ache bearable, as though sharing the weight of her grief with another person made it less crushing. "This is beautiful," Isaac said finally, pausing to look out over the water. "Thank you for showing it to me." "Thomas and I used to come here," Hannah heard herself say, "on Sunday afternoons when the weather was nice. He would talk about his dreams for the future, all the things we would do once he struck it rich in the mines. A bigger house, trips back east to see the ocean, maybe children." She stopped, blinking back tears. Those dreams died with him. Isaac turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Mrs. Catherine, Hannah, may I speak plainly?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I have been where you are." "Not exactly, because every person's grief is unique. But I understand what it feels like to lose someone who mattered. My brother Samuel died when I was 19, caught in a flash flood while we were driving cattle across a river. I blamed myself for years, thought if I had been faster or smarter or braver, I could have saved him. It ate at me until I could barely function." Hannah's breath caught. "What changed?" "Time," Isaac said simply. "And the realization that Samuel would not have wanted me to spend my life drowning in guilt and sorrow. He was the kind of man who laughed easily and loved hard and lived every moment like it was a gift. Dishonoring his memory by refusing to live seemed like the worst thing I could do. So I started trying, bit by bit, to find moments of joy again. To allow myself to laugh without feeling guilty, to make new friends without feeling like I was betraying his memory, to imagine a future that might hold happiness even though he was not in it." Tears were streaming down Hannah's cheeks now, and she made no effort to wipe them away. "I do not know how to do that," she whispered. "I do not know how to let go." "You do not have to let go," Isaac said gently. "Thomas will always be part of who you are. But you can make room for new things too. New experiences, new connections, maybe even new dreams. It does not diminish what you had before. It just means you are still living, still growing, still allowing yourself to be human." Hannah looked up at him, this man who had entered her life so unexpectedly and changed everything without even trying. "Why did you really start sitting beside me, Isaac? And please, tell me the truth this time." Isaac's gray eyes were steady on hers. "Because from the moment I saw you sitting alone in that church, looking so small and sad and determined to bear your pain in solitude, I knew you were the most interesting person I had ever laid eyes on. And I wanted to know you, truly know you, even if all I ever got was an hour on Sunday mornings sitting beside you in silence. I wanted to be part of your world, even in the smallest way possible." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Hannah's heart was racing, her mind spinning with implications and fears, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Isaac," she began, but the words stuck in her throat. "You do not have to say anything," Isaac said quickly. "I did not tell you that to pressure you or make you uncomfortable. I just wanted you to know the truth because you deserve honesty from me." Hannah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Would you like to come to my house for dinner next Sunday? Nothing fancy, just a simple meal. But I think I would like to continue this conversation in a place where we do not have to whisper." The joy that transformed Isaac's face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "I would like that very much, Hannah." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal title, and the sound of it on his lips sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. They walked back toward town slowly, neither of them in any hurry to end the afternoon, and when they finally parted ways at the edge of the churchyard, Hannah felt lighter than she had in years. The week leading up to their dinner felt interminable. Hannah cleaned her small house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors that were already spotless and polishing windows until they gleamed. She planned and replanned the menu half a dozen times, wanting to impress Isaac, but also not wanting to appear as though she was trying too hard. By Sunday morning, she was a bundle of nerves, her hands shaking as she pinned her hair and donned her best dress, a dark blue calico that she had not worn since before Thomas's death. Isaac arrived promptly at 2 in the afternoon, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt that looked new, his dark hair still damp from washing. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers that he must have picked from the fields surrounding town, and when he presented them to Hannah with a slightly self-conscious smile, she felt her heart turn over in her chest. "They are beautiful," she said, accepting the flowers and breathing in their sweet scent. "Come in, please. Dinner is nearly ready." The meal went better than Hannah had dared hope. She had prepared roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and a berry pie that was her mother's recipe. Isaac ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting every dish and asking for seconds in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. They talked easily, the conversation flowing naturally from one topic to another, and Hannah found herself laughing at Isaac's stories about his adventures on various cattle drives, tales full of stubborn longhorns and unpredictable weather and colorful characters he had encountered along the way. "Tell me about growing up in Texas," Hannah said as they lingered over coffee after the meal. "What was it like having 4 older brothers?" Isaac grinned, and the expression made him look years younger. "Chaotic, loud, never a moment of peace or privacy, but I would not trade it for anything. My brothers taught me everything I know about riding and roping and surviving in the world. Daniel was the responsible one, always looking out for the rest of us. Michael had a temper but a good heart. Samuel, the one I lost, was the peacemaker, could talk anyone down from any argument. And Joseph was the dreamer, always had his head in the clouds thinking about faraway places and grand adventures." "Do you think you will ever go back?" Hannah asked. Isaac's expression grew thoughtful. "Maybe. Part of me will always belong to Texas, to that dusty ranch where I grew up. But another part of me feels like I have been searching for something all these years, and I think maybe I have finally found it here in Mineral Point." The intensity in his gaze when he said those words left no doubt about what, or rather whom, he had found. Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she did not look away. "I am glad you came here, Isaac Irwin." "So am I, Hannah Catherine." As the afternoon stretched into evening, they moved from the small dining table to the front porch, where they sat on the steps and watched the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Isaac told Hannah more about his life, the loneliness of the open trail, the satisfaction of honest work, the dreams he had carried with him from town to town. Hannah found herself sharing things she had not spoken of in years, memories of her childhood in Ohio, stories about her parents, the early days of her marriage to Thomas when everything had seemed possible. "He was a good man," Hannah said softly, "kind and hardworking and full of hope. The mine collapse was not his fault. The timbers were weak, had been for weeks, but the owners did not want to spend the money to replace them. 15 men died that day, and Thomas was one of them. I was 3 months pregnant when it happened, and I lost the baby 2 weeks later from the shock and the grief. I wanted to die too, honestly. For months I could not see the point of continuing." Isaac reached over and took her hand, his touch gentle but grounding. "What changed?" Hannah looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt. "Mrs. Whitmore, mostly. She would not let me give up. She came by every day, brought food, sat with me even when I did not want company. She reminded me that Thomas would want me to live, to find some measure of happiness again. It took a long time for me to believe her, but eventually I realized she was right. So I started going through the motions of living, and eventually the motions became real again." "She sounds like a wise woman," Isaac said. "She is. She also told me recently that I should not close myself off to new possibilities just because I am afraid. I think she was talking about you." Isaac's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. "And what do you think?" Hannah turned to face him, her dark eyes meeting his gray ones in the fading light. "I think I am terrified. I think opening my heart to you feels like standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing if I will fly or fall. But I also think that I am tired of being afraid, tired of living in the past, tired of sitting alone in that church pew every Sunday hoping that numbness will pass for peace." "Hannah," Isaac said, his voice rough with emotion, "I would never deliberately hurt you. I know I cannot promise that nothing bad will ever happen, because life does not work that way. But I can promise that I will be honest with you, that I will respect you, that I will stand beside you through whatever comes. And I can promise that my feelings for you are real and deep, and unlike anything I have ever experienced before." The confession should have frightened Hannah, should have sent her retreating back into the safety of her carefully constructed walls. Instead, she felt something inside her unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. "I care for you too, Isaac, more than I thought I was capable of caring for anyone again. It happened so gradually that I did not even realize it was happening until I found myself counting the days until Sunday, until I could see you again." Isaac lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "May I court you properly, Hannah Catherine, with Sunday dinners and walks along the creek and all the traditional steps that decent folks take when they are getting to know each other." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes, Isaac Irwin. I would like that very much." As summer deepened and the Wisconsin heat settled over Mineral Point like a warm blanket, Isaac and Hannah's courtship blossomed into something beautiful and real. True to his word, Isaac courted her properly, with Sunday afternoon visits that stretched into evening, picnics beside the creek, and long walks through town where they greeted neighbors and gradually became known as a couple. The townspeople approved, their initial curiosity giving way to genuine happiness at seeing Hannah smile again, seeing color return to her cheeks and light return to her eyes. Isaac brought her small gifts, never anything expensive or ostentatious, but tokens that showed he was paying attention to her likes and interests. a book of poetry he had ordered special from the shop in Madison, a pretty hair comb he had spotted at the general store, a jar of honey from a local beekeeper, because she had mentioned loving honey in her tea. Hannah reciprocated with carefully prepared meals, shirts she mended for him when she noticed the elbows were wearing thin, and her company, which Isaac seemed to treasure above all else. They talked about everything under the sun: politics and religion, dreams and disappointments, the big questions of life and the small, everyday observations that made up the fabric of existence. Hannah learned that Isaac had a dry sense of humor that could catch her off guard and make her laugh until her sides hurt. Isaac discovered that Hannah had a fierce intelligence and a strong sense of justice that had been dimmed but not extinguished by her grief. They challenged each other, supported each other, and somewhere along the way fell deeply and irrevocably in love. By late August, everyone in Mineral Point knew that Isaac Irwin intended to propose to Hannah Catherine, including Hannah herself. The knowledge sat in her chest like a glowing ember, warming her from the inside out. She knew what her answer would be, had known for weeks, but she waited for Isaac to ask in his own time, understanding that he was being careful with her heart and with his own. The proposal came on a Sunday evening in early September, the air just beginning to carry the first hints of autumn's cooler temperatures. They were walking along their favorite creek path, the setting sun turning the water into liquid gold, when Isaac stopped and turned to face her. His expression was serious, but his eyes were soft with love, and Hannah felt her breath catch in her throat. "Hannah," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see churning beneath the surface. "Before I met you, I was drifting through life without any real purpose or direction. I was existing but not living, going through the motions but never really feeling anything deeply. You changed all of that. You made me want to put down roots, to build a life instead of just surviving from one day to the next. You made me believe in love and hope and second chances." Tears were already streaming down Hannah's face, but she was smiling through them. Isaac reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band, nothing fancy but beautiful in its simplicity. "I know you have been hurt, and I know you carry scars that will never fully heal. I am not asking you to forget Thomas or the life you had before. I'm just asking you to trust me enough to build a new life together, one where we honor the past but do not live in it. Hannah Catherine, will you marry me?" Hannah did not hesitate. "Yes, Isaac. Yes, with all my heart." Isaac slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her close as though she was the most precious thing in the world. When he kissed her, gentle and reverent and full of promise, Hannah felt the last of her walls crumble away. She was no longer the woman who sat alone in church every Sunday, trapped in grief and isolation. She was a woman who had survived unimaginable loss and found the courage to love again, to choose life and hope, and a future that might hold joy alongside sorrow. They were married in October, in the same church where they had first sat side by side all those months ago. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony, his face beaming with satisfaction at the successful conclusion to the romance that had played out in his congregation. Mrs. Whitmore cried through the entire service, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and declaring it the most beautiful wedding she had ever witnessed. The whole town turned out for the celebration, filling the church to capacity and spilling out into the yard, everyone eager to witness the union of two people who had found each other against all odds. Hannah wore a dress of pale ivory that Mrs. Whitmore had helped her sew, her honey-colored hair arranged in an elegant twist with wildflowers tucked into the curls. Isaac wore his best suit, freshly pressed and looking almost uncomfortable in formal attire, but the expression on his face when he saw Hannah walking toward him down the aisle made every heart in the church melt. The love shining in his eyes was so evident, so pure, that there could be no doubt about the depth of his feelings. They exchanged vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through all the days of their lives. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed Hannah with a tenderness that made several of the women in the congregation sigh audibly. As they turned to face their community as a married couple, Hannah felt a sense of completeness she had thought lost forever. She was not forgetting Thomas or the love they had shared, but she was making room for this new chapter, this unexpected blessing that had walked into her life in the form of a persistent cowboy who refused to let her sit alone. The reception was held in the churchyard, tables laden with food contributed by various townspeople, fiddles and guitars providing music for dancing. Hannah and Isaac moved through the celebration in a happy daze, accepting congratulations and well wishes, laughing at the good-natured teasing from Isaac's fellow ranch hands, and stealing quiet moments together whenever possible. When the sun began to set, and the party showed no signs of winding down, they slipped away to the small house that was now theirs together, eager to begin their married life in private. The house felt different with Isaac in it permanently, his presence filling spaces that had been empty for too long. He was careful with Hannah that first night, patient and gentle, making sure she felt safe and cherished. She had been nervous about the intimacy that came with marriage, worried that memories of Thomas would intrude and make her feel disloyal. But when Isaac held her, when he whispered her name like a prayer and touched her with reverent hands, there was no room in her heart or mind for anything except the overwhelming love she felt for this good man who had chosen her. They spent the first weeks of their marriage learning each other's rhythms and routines, figuring out how to share space and make decisions together. Isaac was neater than Hannah had expected, always careful to put things away and clean up after himself. Hannah discovered that Isaac liked his coffee strong and his eggs fried hard, that he had a habit of humming while he worked, and that he slept with one arm thrown protectively across her, even in the deepest sleep. They had small disagreements, of course, about whether the curtains should be open or closed at night, about how much firewood to bring in at once, about whether the chickens Hannah wanted to get would be worth the effort. But they learned quickly how to communicate, how to compromise, how to choose their battles and let the small things go. Isaac continued to work for Samuel Davies at the ranch, leaving before dawn and returning at dusk covered in dust and smelling of horse and sweat. Hannah kept the house, tended her growing vegetable garden, and took in sewing from other townswomen to contribute to their income. She found satisfaction in the domesticity of her new life, in cooking meals for a husband who appreciated every bite, in mending his clothes and keeping their home comfortable. But more than the tasks themselves, she loved the sense of partnership that infused everything they did. She was not just existing anymore. She was building a life, creating a future, participating in something larger than her own small bubble of grief. As autumn turned to winter, and 1876 drew to a close, Hannah realized with a mixture of joy and terror that she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses for 2 months and had been feeling queasy in the mornings, but she had been afraid to hope, afraid to believe that she might actually be carrying Isaac's child after losing Thomas's baby so many years ago. When she finally worked up the courage to share her suspicions with Isaac, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time. "Are you certain?" he asked, setting her down gently and placing his large hand on her still flat stomach. "I think so," Hannah said, her own eyes filling with tears. "But Isaac, I am afraid. What if something goes wrong again? What if I cannot carry the baby to term?" Isaac's expression grew serious, and he took both her hands in his. "Hannah, I will not lie to you and say that everything will definitely be fine. But I will be with you every step of the way, no matter what happens. We will face this together, just like we face everything else." His words steadied her, and Hannah felt some of her fear ease. They decided not to tell anyone else until she was further along, wanting to keep the news private and precious for a little while longer. Hannah took extra care with herself, resting when she was tired and eating well, determined to give this baby every possible chance. Isaac fussed over her constantly, worrying that she was working too hard or not getting enough sleep, until Hannah had to laugh and tell him that she was pregnant, not dying. Winter in Wisconsin that year was harsh, with snow piling up in drifts taller than a man and temperatures that made stepping outside feel like walking into a wall of ice. But inside their little house, Hannah and Isaac were warm and content. They spent long evenings by the fire, Isaac reading aloud from whatever book Hannah had borrowed from Mrs. Whitmore's library, while Hannah knitted tiny clothes for the baby that would arrive in the summer. They talked about names and debated whether they were having a boy or a girl, each secretly hoping for a healthy child regardless of gender. As Hannah's pregnancy progressed, and her belly began to swell with visible evidence of the life growing inside her, the townspeople of Mineral Point rallied around them with support and excitement. Mrs. Whitmore was beside herself with joy, declaring that she had known from the moment she saw Isaac and Hannah together that they were meant to be a family. The women of the congregation organized a quilting bee to create a baby quilt, each woman contributing a square with her own unique pattern. Isaac's fellow ranch hands teased him mercilessly about becoming a father, but their jokes were good-natured and covered genuine happiness for their friend. In April, as the snow finally began to melt and the first green shoots pushed through the thawing ground, Hannah went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, made worse by Hannah's memories of losing her first child and her fear that history would repeat itself. Isaac stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when she screamed at him to leave her alone. Mrs. Whitmore and the midwife, a capable woman named Sarah Thompson, worked together to help Hannah through each contraction, wiping her face with cool cloths and telling her when to push. After nearly 20 hours of labor, Hannah finally delivered a healthy baby boy with a strong set of lungs and a shock of dark hair like his father. The moment Mrs. Thompson placed the squalling infant on Hannah's chest, every moment of pain and fear evaporated, replaced by a love so fierce and overwhelming that it took her breath away. Isaac was crying openly, tears streaming down his weathered face as he looked at his wife and son, and Hannah had never loved him more than she did in that moment. "He is perfect," Isaac whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger and marveling when the little fingers closed around his. "He is ours," Hannah said, and the joy in her voice was unmistakable. They named him Samuel, after Isaac's lost brother, with the middle name Thomas to honor Hannah's first husband. It felt right to connect their son to the people who had shaped their lives, to acknowledge the grief and loss that had brought them together. Little Samuel was a good baby, fussy at times but generally content, and watching Isaac hold their son with such tender care made Hannah fall in love with her husband all over again. The summer of 1877 was one of the happiest periods of Hannah's life. She spent her days caring for Samuel, marveling at every small development, every new expression and sound. Isaac was a devoted father, coming home from the ranch each evening and immediately reaching for his son, talking to the baby in a soft voice and making silly faces that inevitably resulted in gummy smiles. They moved through the rhythms of new parenthood together, taking turns walking the floor with Samuel when he was fussy at night, laughing over diaper disasters, and feeling their hearts expand in ways they had not thought possible. As Samuel grew from an infant into a chubby, curious baby who rolled over and then crawled and finally pulled himself up on shaky legs, Hannah and Isaac's love deepened and matured. They had weathered the challenges of the first year of marriage, the fears and triumphs of bringing a child into the world, and they had emerged stronger and more connected than ever. They still attended church every Sunday, sitting in the back pew that had become theirs, but now Samuel sat between them, babbling cheerfully and charming every person within earshot. Mrs. Whitmore often remarked that she had never seen two people more meant for each other than Hannah and Isaac. "You both came through such darkness," she said one afternoon while visiting Hannah and little Samuel. "But instead of letting that darkness consume you, you found each other and created light. That is a rare and precious thing." Hannah knew she was right. Her life had not turned out the way she had once imagined, but it had become something beautiful nonetheless. She still thought about Thomas sometimes, still felt a pang of sadness when she remembered the dreams they had shared. But those memories no longer haunted her, no longer kept her trapped in the past. Thomas would always be part of her story, but Isaac and Samuel were her present and her future, and she embraced that with gratitude and joy. In the autumn of 1878, when Samuel was learning to walk on wobbly legs and getting into everything he could reach, Hannah discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news brought excitement rather than fear, though Isaac still worried and fussed over her just as much as he had the first time. Their second child, a daughter they named Helen Marie, was born in May of 1879 after a much easier labor than Samuel's had been. She was smaller than her brother had been, with Hannah's honey-colored hair and Isaac's gray eyes, and she fit into their family as though she had always been meant to be there. Life in Mineral Point continued its steady pace. Isaac advanced at the Davies Ranch, eventually becoming the foreman and earning enough that Hannah no longer needed to take in sewing to make ends meet. They talked about buying their own piece of land someday, maybe raising horses or cattle of their own, but for now they were content with what they had. Their home was filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing, with Isaac singing as he helped Hannah with evening chores, with the countless small moments that made up a happy life. By the early 1880s, Samuel was a bright, energetic boy who loved following his father around and learning about ranch work. Helen was a sweet-natured toddler who adored her big brother and could wrap both her parents around her little finger with a single smile. Hannah and Isaac had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long marriage, still finding time for each other despite the demands of raising children, still talking late into the night about dreams and plans and everything in between. On their 10th wedding anniversary in October of 1886, Isaac surprised Hannah by taking her back to the creek path where he had proposed all those years ago. The children were spending the evening with Mrs. Whitmore, who had practically adopted Samuel and Helen as her own grandchildren. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves blazing with color, and Hannah felt 17 again as she walked hand in hand with her husband through the familiar landscape. "I have been thinking," Isaac said as they paused beside the water, watching the current rush over the stones, "about how different my life could have been if I had not walked into that church and decided to sit beside a sad woman in the back pew." Hannah smiled up at him. "I have been thinking about that too. I was so angry at you that first day, so determined to keep you at a distance." "I know." I could feel your irritation radiating off you like heat from a stove. But I also saw something else beneath the anger, something that called to me. I saw a woman who was surviving but not living, and I recognized that because I had been the same way for so long. I thought maybe we could help each other find our way back to living. You did more than help me find my way back, Hannah said, her voice thick with emotion. You gave me a reason to want to live again. You showed me that it was possible to love deeply even after devastating loss, that opening my heart did not mean betraying my past. You gave me Samuel and Helen and this beautiful life we have built together. You gave me everything. Isaac pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. You gave me just as much, Hannah. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You made me believe I was worthy of love and capable of being the kind of man a woman like you deserves. Every day with you is a gift I never take for granted. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun set and the evening stars began to appear. Hannah thought about the woman she had been 10 years ago, so consumed by grief that she could barely function, sitting alone in that church pew and wishing the world would just leave her be. She thought about how close she had come to missing this, to refusing Isaac's quiet persistence and staying locked in her sorrow forever. The thought made her shiver, and she held her husband tighter. "What are you thinking?" Isaac asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I am thinking about how grateful I am that you were too stubborn to take no for an answer," Hannah said, laughing softly. "I am thinking about how lucky I am to have been given a second chance at love, at family, at happiness. I am thinking that I love you more with each passing year, Isaac Irwin, and I cannot wait to see what the future holds for us." "I love you too, Hannah Irwin," Isaac said, and the sound of her married name still sent a thrill through her after all these years. More than words could ever express. They walked home through the gathering darkness, their fingers intertwined, their steps perfectly matched. When they arrived back at their house and relieved Mrs. Whitmore of the children, they tucked Samuel and Helen into bed with extra hugs and kisses. Later, lying in their own bed with Isaac's arm wrapped around her waist, Hannah stared up at the ceiling and counted her blessings. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and holidays, by small triumphs and minor setbacks, by the steady accumulation of moments that made up a life well lived. Samuel grew into a capable young man who worked alongside his father at the ranch, learning everything Isaac could teach him about horses and cattle and the value of honest work. Helen blossomed into a kind-hearted young woman who loved books and music, and had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's determination. In 1891, Isaac and Hannah finally saved enough money to buy a small piece of land just outside Mineral Point. It was not much, just 50 acres with a modest house and a barn that needed repairs, but it was theirs. They moved in during the spring, and Samuel helped his father mend fences and fix up the outbuildings while Helen and Hannah planted a garden and made the house feel like home. They started with a few horses, breeding them for sale to local ranchers and farmers, and gradually built up a small but successful business. Mrs. Whitmore passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1893, and Hannah grieved for the woman who had been like a mother to her during her darkest times. But even in her grief, Hannah could celebrate the life her friend had lived and the impact she had made on the community. At Mrs. Whitmore's funeral, Hannah stood beside Isaac and their children, drawing strength from their presence, and she knew that Mrs. Whitmore would have been proud of the woman Hannah had become, the family she had created, the life she had built from the ashes of tragedy. Samuel married a local girl named Catherine Wells in 1895, and they gave Isaac and Hannah their first grandchild, a boy named Isaac Jr. In 1896, holding her grandson for the first time, seeing Isaac's gray eyes looking out from that tiny face, Hannah felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that was both humbling and extraordinary. She thought about the woman she had been when she first came to Mineral Point as Thomas's young bride, full of dreams and expectations. She thought about the broken woman she had become after his death, convinced that her life was over at 23. And she marveled at the woman she was now, a grandmother with silver threading through her honey-colored hair, a wife of over 20 years to a man she loved more with each passing day, a mother to 2 wonderful children, and a person who had learned that the human heart's capacity for love and resilience was far greater than she had ever imagined. Helen married a teacher named Robert Matthews in 1898, and they settled in Mineral Point, where Robert taught at the local school. Helen gave birth to a daughter, Grace, in 1899, and Hannah spent many happy hours with both her grandchildren, telling them stories and teaching them songs, and passing on the wisdom she had accumulated over the years. As the new century dawned in 1900, Isaac and Hannah sat on the porch of their farmhouse and reflected on the incredible journey they had taken together. Isaac was 53 now, his dark hair liberally streaked with gray, lines deeply etched around his eyes and mouth from years of smiling. Hannah was 47, her face showing the passage of time but still beautiful in the way of women who had learned contentment and grace. Their hands were clasped together, fingers intertwined, just as they had been on so many evenings over the past quarter century. "You ever regret it?" Hannah asked suddenly. "Sitting down in that pew beside me all those years ago, your life might have been easier if you had chosen someone else, someone who was not carrying so much grief and baggage." Isaac turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "Hannah Irwin, in all our years together, have I ever given you any reason to think I regret choosing you?" Hannah shook her head, feeling slightly foolish for asking. "No, never. I suppose I just sometimes wonder what you saw in me that day, sitting there in my black dress looking so miserable and unwelcoming." "I saw courage," Isaac said simply. "I saw a woman who had every reason to give up but who kept showing up, kept trying, kept moving forward even when it must have felt impossible. I saw strength and resilience, and a depth of feeling that most people never experience. I saw someone worth knowing, worth loving, worth building a life with, and every day since then has proven that I was right." Tears filled Hannah's eyes, the good kind of tears that came from being seen and understood and cherished. "I saw strength in you too, Isaac. The strength to approach a stranger who clearly wanted to be left alone, the patience to wait while I figured out how to open my heart again, the courage to love a woman who came with so much history and pain. You saved my life in so many ways." "We saved each other," Isaac corrected gently. "That is what love does. It does not erase the past or magically fix everything, but it gives us a reason to keep going, to keep trying, to keep believing that tomorrow might be better than today." They sat together as the stars emerged overhead, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of their horses moving in the pasture. The life they had built spread around them, tangible evidence of everything they had overcome and achieved together. Inside the house, photograph albums documented their journey, preserving images of wedding days and baby christenings, birthday parties and holiday gatherings, all the milestones that marked a life richly lived. Hannah thought about that first Sunday morning when Isaac had sat beside her in the church pew, disrupting her carefully maintained solitude and setting in motion a series of events that had transformed everything. She thought about how close she had come to turning him away, to insisting on her isolation, and missing out on the greatest blessing of her life. The thought was sobering. a reminder of how easily we could miss our own happiness if we were too afraid to take a chance. "Thank you," Hannah said softly, squeezing Isaac's hand. "For what? For being stubborn. For not giving up on me when I tried to push you away. For seeing something in me worth pursuing even when I could not see it myself. For giving me this life, this family, this love. For everything." Isaac lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had done on the evening he proposed so many years ago. "Thank you for taking a chance on a wandering cowboy who did not have much to offer except his heart. Thank you for trusting me with your pain and your hope. Thank you for Samuel and Helen and the grandchildren, and every morning I wake up with you beside me. Thank you for being the answer to a prayer I did not even know I was praying." As they sat together in the peaceful evening, surrounded by the life they had created through love and determination and unwavering commitment to each other, Hannah felt a sense of completion that went soul deep. Her journey had not been easy, and she bore scars that would never fully fade. But those scars were part of her story, part of what had made her the woman she was, and she would not trade them away even if she could. Because those scars had led her to Isaac, and Isaac had led her to this beautiful, complicated, wonderful life. The years rolled on, bringing more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren as Samuel's and Helen's families grew. Isaac and Hannah aged gracefully, their bodies slowing but their love remaining constant. They still attended church every Sunday when weather and health permitted, still sitting in the back pew that had started everything, and the congregation smiled to see them there, the couple who had found each other in the most unlikely way and built something lasting and true. In the summer of 1910, when Isaac was 63 and Hannah was 57, they celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary with a party attended by children, grandchildren, friends, and neighbors. It was a joyous occasion, filled with laughter and music and abundant food, and as Hannah looked around at the faces of all the people who had become part of their extended family, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was the life she had never dared to dream of during those dark days after Thomas's death, the life that had seemed impossible when she sat alone in that church pew, every Sunday wishing the world would leave her be. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had departed and the children had taken the grandchildren home to bed, Isaac and Hannah found themselves alone in their house. They were both exhausted but happy, still humming with the energy of celebration. Isaac pulled Hannah into his arms on the front porch, and they swayed together in a slow dance even though there was no music playing. 33 years, Hannah murmured against his chest. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we were just starting out, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. "I know what you mean," Isaac said, resting his cheek against the top of her head. "But however long it has not been long enough." "I want 100 more years with you, Hannah," she laughed softly. "I think that might be overly ambitious, but I will take whatever time we are given and be grateful for every moment." They stood together as the night deepened around them, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had weathered every storm. The cowboy who had refused to let a grieving woman sit alone, and the woman who had found the courage to let him into her heart. Their story was not dramatic or spectacular in the way of great legends, but it was real and true and filled with the kind of deep, abiding love that sustained people through all of life's challenges. When they finally went inside and prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routines they had perfected over decades together, Hannah caught sight of their reflections in the bedroom mirror. Two older people, marked by time but still recognizably themselves, still holding hands, still choosing each other day after day. She thought about the young woman she had been, sitting in that church pew wrapped in her grief, And she wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that love would find her again in the most unexpected way, that her story was far from over. But perhaps, Hannah reflected as Isaac pulled her close in their bed and they settled into sleep, perhaps not knowing the future was part of what made life beautiful. The uncertainty, the risk, the leap of faith required to open your heart to another person even when you had every reason to keep it closed. That was where the magic happened, in the space between fear and hope, between grief and joy, between yesterday and tomorrow. Isaac and Hannah lived many more years together, well into their 70s, their love deepening and maturing with each passing season. They saw their grandchildren grow up and have children of their own, expanding the family tree in ways that brought constant joy. They weathered illness and loss, celebrated triumphs, and supported each other through disappointments, always maintaining the partnership they had forged on that long-ago Sunday morning when a persistent cowboy had sat down beside a lonely woman in church. When Isaac passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1924, just 2 weeks shy of his 77th birthday, Hannah was holding his hand. She grieved for him deeply, the pain of losing him cutting through her like a blade. But alongside the grief was an overwhelming gratitude for the nearly 40 years they had shared. He had given her a second chance at life, at love, at happiness, and she had taken that chance and built something beautiful with it. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she would see him again someday, and the knowledge brought comfort during the long days of adjusting to his absence. Hannah lived another 3 years, surrounded by the love of her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent those final years telling stories about Isaac, about their courtship and their marriage and all the adventures they had shared. She wanted the younger generations to understand what true love looked like, how it was built through daily choices and consistent commitment, through showing up for each other day after day, even when it was hard, through choosing partnership and communication over pride and anger. On a warm Sunday morning in June of 1927, Hannah Catherine Irwin passed away peacefully in her sleep, just shy of her 74th birthday. Her children found her looking peaceful, a small smile on her face, as though she had gone to sleep dreaming of Isaac and woken up to find him waiting for her. At her funeral, the church was packed to overflowing with people whose lives she had touched, whose families had become intertwined with hers over the decades. They laid her to rest beside Isaac in the Mineral Point Cemetery, under a shared headstone that reads simply, "Together in life, together in death, together in eternity." And so ended the love story that had begun with a cowboy and a grieving woman in a church pew. A story that proved that second chances were real, that love could bloom even in the hardest soil, and that sometimes the best things in life came from taking a risk on a stubborn stranger who refused to let you sit alone. Their legacy lived on through their children and grandchildren, through the stories told around dinner tables, through the example they had set of what marriage could be when built on a foundation of respect, communication, patience, and unwavering devotion. The woman who had sat alone in church every Sunday had found her happy ending after all, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined on that long-ago morning when everything changed.